Hey, this is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are going to start the first part of Unit 3, Note 6, Fighting the War. We'll get through part of this today. Between April 12, 1861 and April 9, 1865, the Union and Confederate armies fought over 10,000 battles. 50 of these are what we would consider to be major battles. I had you look at 10 of those major battles. 100 more of the battles were ones that we would consider, historians consider having significant impact on the war, and the rest were raids, skirmishes, naval battles, sieges, and bombardments. Over the course of these 4 years, the war would create over 620,000 casualties from the Union and Confederate armies combined, and another 1,000 civilian casualties. To better understand how the Civil War was fought, we will look at a few of the important battles, some of the people and events that significantly impacted the war's outcome. We watched a music video by the band Fun, and then we went on to begin looking at some of these important battles. Shortly after seceding, Confederate states took over all U.S. federal buildings, including post offices and military forts. Lincoln had to decide how he was going to respond. One of the most urgent problems was that the commander of Fort Sumter in South Carolina refused to surrender the military fort to the Confederacy. South Carolina decided to cut off the fort and starve the 100 U.S. troops into surrendering. Lincoln feared that sending more supplies and troops would cause more states to secede, and he's got to try to hang on to those few border states that did not secede with the rest of the South. So he just decides to send food. But Confederate leaders still took this as an act of aggression, and on the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on the U.S. troops at Fort Sumter. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. So in your notes packet, please fill in for Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861. The first shots of the Civil War were fired. On July 21, 1861, U.S. troops heading towards the Confederate capital of Richmond met up with Confederate troops at Manassas Junction along Bull Run Creek. This first coordinated battle of the Civil War took place on farmland that belonged to a man named Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean had a grocery store business, and he owned that property. And after the battle's over, he just can't, there's going to be 2 battles fought on this property, and he just is like, you know what, this is not good. I'm going to move to where there's less fighting going on. And he actually moves to a little town called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Thinking that the war couldn't possibly last very long, some families actually brought a picnic lunch to watch the clash between the two armies. They quickly realized that war is no picnic. Both armies brought about 18,000 troops to this battle. The Northern troops were not very well trained, and the Southern troops were able to bring in reinforcements. Northern forces ended up retreating, so they lose this battle. However, even though the South had technically claimed this as a victory, both sides realized this war was not going to be some quick 90-day little skirmish. This was going to be difficult, and it was going to last longer than the estimated 90 days, and both sides knew they were going to have to fight real hard for this. So what we need to know about the first battle of Bull Run is that both sides realize it's going to be a long and difficult war. You notice I put the picnic basket there in your notes packet so that you can be reminded that this is where some families thought it'd be kind of a fun idea to just have a family outing to watch the war. Confederate General Robert E. Lee pushed Southern forces up into Maryland. Remember, Maryland is one of the 5 border states that allow slavery but did not secede. Union General George McClellan launched an attack on Confederate troops along Antietam Creek near Dunkirk Church on September 17, 1862. This was the first battle on Union soil, and with help from Generals Burnside and General Hooker, Union forces were able to stop General Lee's invasion of Maryland, but it came at huge costs. Okay, there's General McClellan. This battle ends up being the bloodiest single day in American history, and we have never come close. So, and I hope it remains the bloodiest single day in American history, because I don't ever want the United States to have any situation where it would cost us 23,000 people or more in one day. That's catastrophic. 23,000 casualties in one day. And it was a vital Union victory, a barely Union victory, but thankfully a victory nonetheless for the Union. It wasn't as successful, though, as Lincoln had hoped. Lincoln had wanted General McClellan to lead Union troops aggressively. After the Confederate Army had surrendered, he wanted McClellan to take those troops and just basically go after them and wear them down to the point where they're just like, you know what, this isn't worth it anymore. But McClellan had been through this tragic and awful experience, and his men were mortified and horrified, and they'd lived through a lot of trauma, and he decides to let the soldiers recover. The Union soldiers get a break. Lincoln was ticked off, and he actually fires General McClellan for failing to act aggressively enough after Antietam. Antietam ends up being the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. The horrifying death toll at Antietam revealed new realities of warfare. In previous wars, battles were fought in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, but new improved rifles and ammunition made killing people easier from further distances. In the America's Story of a Civil War episode that students watched, it talked a lot about the mini ball bullet and the change in the way that those bullets were made. And you can see on here that it's more cone shaped than the old round musket balls. And there's also these grooves. Okay, if you think about a football, we like to have the football the shape that it is because it gets a spin on it and it can sail through the air much faster and more accurate. And that's exactly what happens with this kind of bullet. So there's, we call this rifling. There's grooves for the bullet to spiral inside the, there's also grooves inside of the rifle's barrel. And so as that bullet is leaving the barrel, it goes faster and it's going to be more accurate than ever before. These bullets do a lot of damage. Medical care was not as advanced as the new weapons used in the Civil War. Doctors back then still didn't even know what caused infections, so they were not properly washing all of the surgical tools. They were not properly sterilizing things. The most common procedure during the war was amputations, and not necessarily because of the actual wound, but because of infections that the wounds got in the medical hospitals after someone had been wounded. Now, while most women who worked as nurses during the Civil War stayed back in the safety of those military hospitals, Clara Barton does not. She went along with the military doctors and followed the Union troops into battle. She went across the battlefield, tending to troops where they fell, and she was nicknamed the Angel of the Battlefield. After the Civil War, Clara Barton went on to found the American Red Cross. So she's nicknamed the Angel of the Battlefield. She followed the Union Army into battle to tend to the wounded. After the Civil War, she founded the American Red Cross. When running for president, Lincoln had pledged that he was against the spread of slavery, but he also recognized that he really didn't have the power, nor did he say he wanted to do anything to abolish slavery in the states where it already existed. While southern states feared slavery was at risk, Lincoln didn't really have the power to write a law to ban slavery. Remember, the executive branch does not make laws. The executive branch's job is to enforce the laws that Congress or the legislative branch has made. So he's the executive, and he, even if he had wanted to try to ban slavery or abolish slavery in the whole United States, he didn't have the authority to actually do that. Lincoln repeatedly stated that the war was about preserving the Union up until right after the important victory at Antietam. Lincoln sees all of this damage done. He sees 23,000 casualties in one day. He sees the brutalities of this war over the past year and a half, and he says, what, we have to do something that makes this all worth it, and that ignites a little more passion in many of the Americans, because we're starting to lose support for this war because of all the death and violence that it's caused. So in the fall of 1862, right after the important victory at Antietam, he issues what we call the Emancipation Proclamation, which would take effect on January 1st, 1863. And this is a presidential or executive order, and it has four main purposes. Number one, it's going to declare the slaves in the Confederate states, the states that were rebelling and had left the Union, Those are the states where he's declaring the slaves to be free. 2, it's a military tactic. It's meant to weaken the South's slave-based workforce. If you're off fighting for the South, you don't have to worry so much about your crops because you have people that you require to work your fields for you. But now suddenly, if your slaves are being freed, you don't have anyone running your plantation, and there's more to worry about at home. Congress allowed African Americans to also enlist in the Union Army at this point. It gains more soldiers for our Union Army, and it also gives African Americans the opportunity to fight for their own freedom. And it helped gain support from European countries where slavery had already been banned. France and England kind of felt like they couldn't morally support the South because this turns the war into a fight about slavery. Whereas we had argued over and over again before this that this isn't about slavery, this is about keeping the Union together. Now it's kind of hard to pretend like it's not about slavery anymore. So in our notes, we're going to highlight 3 context clues that help us to understand the Emancipation Proclamation. It's an executive order by President Lincoln given in the fall of 1862 that stated all slaves in the Confederate States would be free as of January 1st, 1863. There's a timeline. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He wrote it in September of 1862, but it didn't go into effect till January 1st, 1863. So in our timeline on page 2 of our packet, you're going to write in that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in that 1862 spot, knowing that it won't take effect until January of 1863. All right, with that, when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation allowing African Americans to enlist in the Army and the military, right away in the war, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass had been saying this all along. Hey, you want African Americans fighting this war because they have the most to gain out of the victory for the North. So Congress finally passed this and allowed black recruits to enlist in the Union Army in 1862. About 186,000 African Americans, both free and former slaves, enlisted in the Union Army. Another 30,000 joined the Union Navy. As Union troops went through the South, they could, if they were victorious in a certain area, they could go and they could recruit new soldiers from the plantations by freeing those slaves. Massachusetts was one of the first states to organize a black regiment. The most famous was the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, commanded by Robert Gould Shaw, the son of abolitionists. The Massachusetts 54th Regiment fought at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. In addition to the usual worries about going into battle, these soldiers also faced the fear that if captured, they would be sold into slavery. The South kind of retaliates to the Emancipation Proclamation by issuing their own proclamation that any soldiers, any black soldiers, or any former slaves caught fighting for the Union Army and captured would be sold into slavery. So, the Massachusetts 54th Regiment was a famous Union Army unit made up of all black soldiers. 2 of those were sons of Frederick Douglass. They fought at the Battle of Fort Wagner. Keep in mind that this is during this war, the black troops had to stay segregated into their own units, and they could not be commanded by a black officer, so they had to have a white officer. So you see here in the painting, there's Robert Gould Shaw, and he's commanding. This is a scene out of the attack at Fort Wagner, the Battle of Fort Wagner, where the Massachusetts 54th bravely led the rest of the Union troops into battle. This is actually part of what the movie Glory is based on. So if you're interested in watching a Civil War movie, that would be a great one to watch. All right, and then we finished up the class period by looking at the Emancipation Proclamation and following those directions. So we'll finish up these notes later on. Thanks for listening.